In the morning the sun rose warm and bright, and Stuart slipped into the river again for an early dip. After breakfast he left his car hidden under a skunk cabbage leaf and walked up to the post office. While he was filling his fountain pen from the public inkwell, he happened to glance toward the door, and what he saw startled him so that he almost lost his balance and fell into the sink. A girl about 2 inches high had entered and was crossing the floor toward the mailboxes. She wore sports clothes and walked with her head held high, and her hair was a stamen from a flower. Stuart began to tremble from excitement. "Must be the Ames girl," he said to himself, and he kept out of sight behind the inkwell as he watched her open her mailbox, which was about a quarter of an inch wide, and pull out her letters. The storekeeper had told the truth. Harriet was pretty, and of course she was the only girl Stuart had ever encountered who wasn't miles and miles taller than he was. Stuart figured that if the two of them were to walk along together, her head would come up a little higher than his shoulder. The idea filled him with interest. He wanted to slide down to the floor and speak to her, but he didn't dare. All his boldness had left him, and he stayed hidden behind the inkwell until Harriet had gone. When he was sure that she was out of sight, he stole out of the post office and slunk down the street to the store, half hoping that he would meet the beautiful little girl, half fearing that he would. "Have you any engraved stationery?" he asked the storekeeper. "I'm behind on my correspondence." The storekeeper helped Stuart up onto the counter and found some letter paper for him, small paper, marked with the initial L. Stuart whipped out his fountain pen and sat down against a 5-cent candy bar and began to letter to Harriet. "My dear Miss Ames," he wrote, "I am a young person of moderate proportions. By birth I am a New Yorker, but at the moment I am traveling on business of a confidential nature. My travels have brought me to your village. Yesterday the keeper of your local store, who was as honest as his face, in an open manner, gave me a most favorable report of your character and appearance." At this point in the letter, Stuart's pen ran dry from the long words, and Stuart had to keep the storekeeper lower him head first into a bottle of ink so that he could refill the pen. Then he went back to his letter writing. "Pray forgive me, Miss Ames," continued Stuart, "for presuming to strike up an acquaintance on so slender an excuse in our physical similarity. But of course the fact is, as you yourself must know, there are very few people who are only 2 inches in height. I say 2 inches, actually, I'm somewhat taller than that. My only drawback is that I look something like a mouse. I am nicely proportioned, however, am also muscular beyond my years. Let me be perfectly blunt. My purpose in writing this brief note is to suggest that we meet. I realize that your parents may object to the suddenness and directness of my proposal, as well as to my somewhat mouse-like appearance, so I think probably it might be a good idea if you just didn't mention the matter to them. What they don't know won't hurt them. However, you probably understand more about dealing with your father and mother than I do, so I won't attempt to instruct you, but will leave everything to your good judgment. Being an outdoors person, I am camped by the river in an attractive spot at the foot of Tracy's Lane. Would you care to go for a paddle with me in my canoe? How about tomorrow afternoon, towards sundown, when the petty annoyances of the day are behind us and the river seems to flow more quietly in the long shadows of the willows? These tranquil spring evenings are designed by special architects for my enjoyment of boatmen. I love the water, dear Miss Ames, and my canoe is like an old and trusted friend." Stuart forgot in the excitement of writing Harriet that he did not own a canoe. "If you wish to accept my invitation, be at the river tomorrow about 5 o'clock. I shall await your arrival with all the eagerness I can muster. And now I must close this offensive letter and catch up with my affairs. Yours very truly, Stuart Little." After Stuart had sealed his letter in an envelope, he turned to the storekeeper. "Where can I get a hold of a canoe?" he asked. "Right here," replied the storekeeper. He walked over to his souvenir counter and took down a little birch bark canoe with the words "Summer Memories" stamped on the side. Stuart examined it closely. "Does she leak?" asked Stuart. "It's a nice canoe," replied the storekeeper, bending it gently back into shape with his fingers. "It will cost you 75 cents plus a penny tax." Stuart took out his money and paid the man. Then he looked inside the canoe and noticed that there were no paddles. "What about the paddles?" he said, making his voice sound businesslike. The storekeeper hunted around among the souvenirs, but he couldn't seem to find any paddles. So he went over to the ice cream counter and came back with two little cardboard spoons, the kind you use for eating ice cream on picnics. "These will work out all right as paddles," he said. Stuart took the spoons, but he was disgusted with the looks of them. "They may work out all right," said Stuart, "but I would hate to meet an American Indian while I had one of these things in my hand." The storekeeper carried the canoe and the paddles out in front of the store and set them down in the street. He wondered what this tiny boatman would do next, but Stuart never hesitated. Taking a piece of thread from his pocket, he lashed the paddles to the thwarts, swung the canoe lightly up on his head, and walked off with it as calmly as though he were a Canadian guide. He was very proud of his ability with boats, and he liked to show off.